Everybody.
Good evening, Madam.
It's great to see you today. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator. I'd like to introduce you to Patrick O'Donnell, one of our educators. And we're really happy you're here. So how many of you have traveled a distance to come here tonight? Yes?
It's not too far.
Not too far? Where are you from?
Amesbury, Mass.
Okay, not too bad. Yes, okay. And we have a New Rochelle couple here, which is great. And anybody local? Oh, you're all visitors. That's wonderful. And for how many is this your first visit to the Rockwell Museum? Great. Oh, good. I love that we have new and regulars too. So thank you for your patience in sitting on stools. And the reason I thought it might be nice to do that is because it'll give us an opportunity to kind of walk through the galleries. Because tonight we're going to talk a little bit about this exhibition, which is called Rockwell and Realism in an Abstract World. And it's an exhibition that went on view this June and will stay up through the summer and into the fall months. But it actually began with a particular painting that Rockwell did, which was published on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1962. And of course, it's actually right here in the center of the gallery. We've been very fortunate to get this piece on loan from a private collection. And as you know, Rockwell was really a visual storyteller. So in this particular piece, he has a very particular story to tell. And I wonder, in looking at it, if you'll get it pretty quickly. How do you observe what is happening in this piece? Anybody want to give a stab?
It's a contrast between conservative, gentleman, and modern.
Yes, exactly. So Rockwell, of course, is contrasting someone who looks very conservative with the kind of painting in the background that in 1962 would have already been popular and written about for about 15 years, and that's a movement called abstract expressionism. For those of you who are familiar with it, you'll recognize that there were certain practitioners of the art form, abstract expressionism, that were very well known. Probably the most well known would be Jackson Pollock. And others were Willem de Kooning and Helen Frankenthaler and a whole cadre of artists who in the late 1940s gathered together in New York City to really decide that they were going to change the art world, that they were going to create a new art form that basically challenged all of the tradition that had come before them, even the modernism that took place during the early 20th century. And Rockwell, who by this time had been working for the Saturday Evening Post for about 46 years, understood that his place in society as a visual storyteller was coming up against something that was completely new and that was challenging the art of realism. So if we take a look at this, I think there's some interesting visual clues, because Rockwell, of course, never put anything in a painting that wasn't there for a very good reason. And I think in a lot of ways this is his treatise on contemporary painting at the time. I think he understood that as a visual storyteller, as someone who worked for popular magazines, as somebody who loved to as he said, tell stories in pictures. To me, the story is the first thing and the last thing. He understood that the world of abstraction was a world that he would never enter. And yet, he was extremely interested in modern painting. He was curious about it. In fact, we know that in the 1930s, when he took a trip to Europe, he experimented with what he called modern techniques. Because at times he'd feel as though he was a little out of date, a little old-fashioned, and he understood that there was a world around him, a painting, that was changing very quickly. So in doing the painting here, he did what he always does. He creates a sense of visual contrast, something that's very different from something else. And he creates a backdrop that approximates what a Jackson Pollock drip style painting might be. So to give you a sense of how Rockwell worked, but how Pollock worked, this essentially is a good sized painting. Rockwell did work fairly large, as you've seen his originals as you come through the galleries, but his paintings were still easel paintings. So he was going through a long series of steps to plan his artwork. Everything from a small thumbnail sketch to gathering his props and models very carefully, to photographing them, and finally to making a large-scale drawing that would depict his exact composition. And finally, that drawing would be transferred in outline form onto his canvas. So he was not an expressionist by any means. He was a very methodical painter. But this is an easel painting. It's the size of it's a painting that he did on a large easel, but he's working up close with very fine artist brushes with pigment oil colors that would have come down through the ages. But if you look at Jackson Pollock here, who is working in the manner in which he was known to work, the canvas has come off the easel, it's on the floor, or it would have been on a wall. And he's doing something that I think was very unique to him. He was painting from every direction. So he would slowly move around the canvas that was on the floor, and he would basically be throwing or dripping paint, creating this beautiful web of color and line, and that's really what activated his canvases. But instead of using very fine oil paint and sable brushes, he was using house paint. This is a kind of an enamel. It says it on the can. He wasn't necessarily mixing it. He would, you can see here there's basically a brush in every one of the cans that is set up. And he's just really going about the activity of literally creating action paintings. This is kind of interesting, the photograph in itself, because it was taken by Martha Holmes, who was actually hired by Life magazine to do a sort of documentary on Pollock. And in the 50s, magazines were actually asking the question, is Jackson Pollock the greatest painter who ever lived? And so you can imagine that if critics are thinking about Pollock that way, Rockwell and other artists who painted in a realistic manner were kind of the antithesis of this. How are you? It's good to see you. So in that, I guess I would call the challenge of realism during mid-20th century America. Because abstract expressionism was a movement that came up after World War II, at a time when artists were really seeking to express their feelings about a changing world. So expressionism really became a kind of an outlet for artists who were really trying to think and see in a new way. Okay? We have an interesting print down here by Pollock, and it was done as early as 1942. Just to give you a little background, Pollock had come up, he was actually born out west, the youngest of 5, and he basically came to New York City during the Great Depression, and he was part of the Works Progress Administration that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had established to help support artists. So he and others like him, many of the New York School artists, Franz Klein and Willem de Kooning, were actually paid about $39 a week to do public murals and paintings. And after that was over, they really had to find a new way of working. So fortunately for Jackson Pollock, he began to attract the art world's attention, and especially the attention of some very influential critics. One in particular named Clement Greenberg, who began to formulate kind of a hypothesis about, and you've probably heard of this, high art and low art. So high art was really the art that came solely from the artist's intuition and feelings and emotions. And it was not governed by anything commercial. Realism, and especially illustration, was viewed as low art because that was the art, it was felt at the time, that was commercial, that was understandable by a broad popular public, that in some ways was sentimental. And these were actually the traits that the Expressionists were sort of railing against. And I just love the quote, because I think this says it all. So Rockwell said, "My ability evidently lies in telling stories, and modern art doesn't go in much for that sort of thing." So I think it gives you a sense of how he was feeling. What's fun is we have in the museum's archives, we have an archive of about 350,000 objects, everything from Rockwell's reference photographs to correspondence, fan mail, business mail, his checkbooks, you know, everything that went into his working and professional life. But this is just one of many photographs from a series that shows him in his studio creating a kind of a faux abstract expressionist work. So here, there's some fun differences. Here Rockwell is trying to use commercial paint, but he's got these tiny little paint cans instead of Jackson Pollock's big, you know, larger cans and maybe commercial brushes. You know, Helen Frankenthaler, for example, there's a great video of her online where she's actually brushing paint onto a canvas with a broom. So you can see the difference. Also, Rockwell has his floor neatly covered so that he will not mess it up. He was very, very tidy. In fact, he swept his studio several times a day when he was working, and he really liked a very orderly space. So this was very messy for him, and it must have killed him, I can only imagine. We do have some photographs in this series where he has his shoes off, probably very likely because he didn't want to get paint on them. So it's a lot of fun. But you can see in the background that there are some studies, and he's trying to figure out, you know, what should that abstract painting in the background look like? Ultimately, he settled on something that looks a lot like a Jackson Pollock, and if you look closely here, there's a kind of a JP right above the man's head to give you a little clue of what he's been trying to do. These are kind of fun too. The three studies here are actually from the museum's permanent collection. We've really never exhibited them before. So these are also swatches that he created in a variety of techniques, trying to figure out, you know, can any of these be right for the painting I'm trying to work on. There is a little bit of fun behind this, though, because when Rockwell had this cover published, there was a little note inside the Saturday Evening Post that said, it was a quote by him, and it said, "If I were young, I would paint this way too." So what he did was he had other studies, and he sent one of them to the Cooperstown Art Association in Cooperstown, New York, and he signed it with an Italian name. And it won first prize in an art competition. And the other one he sent up to the Brooklyn Museum, signed with his middle name, Percival, and that won an honorable mention. So I think he was having a little bit of fun with this, even though he understood that he was an outsider generally. He was looking at it with a little bit of humor, and I think he was sort of always very self-deprecating, so without taking himself too seriously. Though he did say, I love to get fan mail. I love to get mail from my fans, and he did. He got it by the bagful. But he said, I would love it if the critics would notice me too. So I think he had a little bit of a feeling about it. But this quote by Pollock says a lot too. Pollock said, "The modern artist is working with space and time and expressing his feelings rather than illustrating." So you can see it right there, feeling versus the specificity of an illustration or a storytelling picture. In this area, there are some other pieces that are kind of interesting. Helen Frankenthaler was probably the most well-known of the female artists who were involved with the Abstract Expressionist group. She developed a slightly different system of working in that she would take unprimed canvas and she would basically thin out house paint and she would pour it so that you know, it sort of created this great expressive and in some ways dramatic formula, but it was, you know, a very different way than the way that Jackson Pollock was working. And there were people like Barnett Newman, who was also very much a part of this endeavor, but he was really working in a very geometric way. So, you know, he was basically breaking up his canvases or his prints with what he called zip lines. In some cases, these would be zip lines that were meant to create a sense of rhythm and structure in his composition. But he was not actually at all interested in the drama of dripping or throwing paint. So I think the movement at the time had a lot of variety in it. For example, here, this artist, Robert Motherwell, was married to Helen Frankenthaler, and they definitely maintained very distinct ways of working. Motherwell was not necessarily a part of that New York school from an early age. So Pollock and Lee Krasner, his wife, and Willem de Kooning, they knew each other for a very long time. But Robert Motherwell actually came up, he had studied at Columbia University. He was actually studying art history and was not terribly trained in formal art technique. So he became interested in the surrealist way of working, which was introduced a kind of an automatic drawing. So drawing by allowing your mind basically to roam free, sometimes involved in dream imagery, but you can see that it's just this beautiful, it's almost like a Rorschach test where he's allowing the paint to express just with the movement of his arm. So I'd say this gallery sort of sets the tone for the exhibition, and the exhibition kind of spans out in two directions. On the left-hand side, and we'll take a walk in a minute, what we start to see is that though abstraction during the mid-20th century was an extremely powerful and changing art form that really impacted the way that a lot of artists were working, realism didn't stay away for very long. As we move into the gallery to the left, we're going to take a look at some pop art and some photorealism and some contemporary abstract, some contemporary realism. But on the right-hand side, I'll be able to share with you the way that illustrators were absorbing these ideas, because, you know, illustrators wanted to remain modern. They were wanting to, they had to continue to tell stories, but they wanted to find a way to do it that seemed more contemporary. So I think what we'll do first is maybe move into the room over here.
Yes.
Get you walk. It's true. Yeah, that story has been recounted, and in fact, there are stories about de Kooning having a coffee table book of Rockwell's work, you know, in his home, and having visited an exhibition that Rockwell had at the Dannenberg Gallery in New York City. So there was definitely some interchange or exchange there, for sure.
The pictures of, I guess there's no Pollock actual picture in there, is there?
Say that again?
Is there a Jackson Pollock picture in there?
There is a print. We have a print.
Okay.
We weren't able to get a large-scale work.
Well, my question was,
yes.
I guess the two you have examples of, I assume those are not considered the best examples of their work? Of
Pollock, no. I mean, the best examples you would probably find in the Museum of Modern Art, and you know, places that really have modern collections.
Are they fairly representative, or as far as trying to compare?
Well, as far as the styles of the work, and in terms of what was happening at the time, I think it reflects the diversity of the kinds of approaches that abstractionists during the mid-20th century had. You know, everything from the kind of work that Pollock was doing with action painting to, you know, color field painting. So artists were finding different ways to express themselves. Yeah. But within a fairly short time, in the 1960s, there was a very different point of view that emerged. And that was a group of artists who became well known as pop artists. Pop definitely came from the word popular, where artists began to look around at the world at a very commercial culture, where advertising was extremely prevalent, and they were literally lifting those images from the world around them and using them as art, which to us looks very mundane right now, but at the time it was very shocking. Just take, for example, this piece by Roy Lichtenstein, who had a very different kind of inspiration for an artist. He was, in the 1960s, very attracted to comic books. And what you can see here is actually a little bit of a parody on abstract expressionism, on that broad brushstroke that, you know, sort of came from the artist's arm, not hand, but arm. But what he's done is he's translated it into something that looks very graphic, with thick black lines, with Ben-Day dots, which would have allowed a certain amount of ink to move on to the page in the printing process. And you know, for him, he sees the beauty in the design of those strokes, but it's definitely a piece that's gone through a process that was very exacting in terms of the printing process. There's a little tiny inset here, and this is actually the particular page in a comic book that he was inspired by when doing the piece. But there are other artists like Klaus Oldenburg who took very simple things and made beautiful large sculptures out of them in some cases. Here we have a felt tea bag and this great small sculpture of a profiterole. And really, I think artists are looking around and mining their environment for things that sort of have interesting visual impact. The most well-known of the pop artists was definitely Andy Warhol. Warhol was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he came from a family of parents who were actually born in Eastern Europe. And I believe he was the youngest of about 5 children. And as a child, he was unwell at certain times in his life. So he was confined to his bed, and one of the things that he did quite a bit was, you know, look at visual material. He loved magazines. He actually loved to cut out pictures of celebrities. And of course, later on, one of the subjects that he became very well known for were his portrayals of famous people. You might remember that idea of everybody will have 15 minutes of fame idea was definitely something that came from him. And we find that, you know, in our contemporary times to be true. It's not unusual to be famous just for being famous, like the Kardashians, or I'm sure we could name a lot of people. But Warhol actually started his career as a commercial artist. He was an illustrator, did quite a bit of fashion design, he did shoe design, and ultimately turned his hand to a process that was also a reproductive process. You know, you have illustrators who's, say for example, Norman Rockwell with the Saturday Evening Post. By 1930, the Post had about 3 million weekly subscribers. By the 50s, about 6 million. So you can imagine how many imprints of each of each of his images there would have been. Warhol began silk screening and creating lithographs that could be reproduced over and over again. The Marilyn, his Marilyn is very famous. He created it in a number of formats, and it was actually done shortly after Marilyn Monroe passed away. And it was based upon a movie still. So, you know, he was finding ways to adjust the image, and what he said was he loved the silkscreen process, because silkscreen basically is there's a large screen, and there are ways of masking certain areas so that paint will only go in certain areas and not in others. So you can actually create a number of prints, but each of them is slightly different. And he said he really enjoyed that quality of the silkscreen or printing process, so that he could create repetitive works, but that each had something that was just a little bit different. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay.
Did you see the Andy Warhol that was at the Women's College Museum? It was fantastic.
Which, oh, the show?
Yeah.
Was there a show?
A couple of years ago.
Okay.
And it took up a lot of it. It really was, I don't know where it went after that, but it was wonderful.
I didn't get to see it, but I have been to the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. It's actually the largest museum in America devoted to a single artist's work. And it's an enormous and very interesting place if you ever get to Pittsburgh. Okay. Jeff Koons is somebody who you might know as an artist who creates very large-scale sculptures of things that he says are banal. Balloon sculptures, Michael Jackson with his pet monkey, and things like this, things that are kind of cartoony characters that are just part of our society. And interestingly, he has a different sort of attitude than maybe the abstract expressionists did, who felt that their art was very serious, in some ways very dark, you know, full of emotion, in some cases anger. Jeff Koons basically says, I really want to create images that are fun and that bring a smile and that bring a little bit of sort of the aspects of life that people are enjoying. And so I think he has the recognition that what he is doing is taking images from popular culture, but sort of presenting them to the public in a new way. And Koons himself has, become, interestingly, a kind of icon, because the manner in which he presents his work could almost be sort of present in, centuries-old institutions, because his sculptures are created with such a high level of beautiful high level of finish that it's hard to believe that they're actually portraying such simple, banal things. So I think that the dichotomy of that is something that he's kind of interested in.
He has a little factory of people who work to produce.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. Bless you.
He,
yes.
As I've read, supervises to make sure the perfections are.
Absolutely. Yes. And that technique goes back centuries as well. That's right, yeah. So that's an important point. Andy Warhol also worked that way too, because he had a place in New York called the Factory, and you might have heard of it, where it was sort of a place where many fashionable people came in and out, but there were also lots of artists who assisted him in his process. And I think the notion of the artist as the person who's generating the ideas is one that, in some ways is very modern, but also centuries old, as you point out. So, good.
I was at the talk last week about the, creating and merchandising art.
Yes.
And to me, Rockwell has all these magazine covers.
Yes.
But having the true original is something really special, as opposed to Warhol. I mean, you probably couldn't tell which one was the first one that came off the press versus the last one that came off this press. So.
Well, you're right. I mean, I think it's kind of a different way of looking at it. You know, in Warhol's case, the idea of having more than one thing that could circulate, you know, for him was very natural because he came up through commercial art, and his art was actually reproduced commercially too. So then he begins kind of working with this idea that maybe there doesn't need to be just one. So it's a different. Rockwell.
He made all of his own, but Warhol had someone making, you know, his, you know, for him.
Right. So he was kind of the idea or the initiator. Yeah. And having a process by which the pieces would go through. But Rockwell was trained in a very traditional manner in certain ways. And we have some good artists in this group. I want you to pipe up and jump in. Elwood Smith, our resident illustrator. And Cynthia. And Patrick and anybody else who wants to. But in fact, Rockwell really was painting for the ages. You know, he came up from looking at the tradition of classical painting. His teachers at the Art Students League were emphasizing traditional things like anatomy and drawing. So for Rockwell, who really didn't have to paint this big at all, those paintings were done as a serious manner of producing paintings, even though they were going to be reproduced for commercial magazines, and would be on, say, the cover of a magazine for a period of a week. So he might work for months, in some cases that we know of, even a year, to create something that would go away in about a week. So it's just a different mindset, I think. That's an interesting point.
I know they overlap somewhat, but you think that they were like contemporaries, that Rockwell would have been, you know, his pictures, paintings would be as valuable as Warhol?
Well, I mean, interestingly, the values of Rockwell's work have gone up extravagantly. There's one piece called Saying Grace, which we were fortunate to have on loan here for many years, and it's gone to auction. It went about 2 years ago, and it did break the record for the American Paintings auction at Sotheby's at about over 46 million. Now, you know, of course, as with anything, I think it takes a lot to establish an artist's reputation, and I think we've been fortunate. There's been a lot of dialogue about Rockwell's work. There have been you know, we've done a lot of traveling exhibitions. A lot of people have written about his work, creating interest in it. And so then you see how the marketplace sort of reacts and reevaluates. So in fact, if you had sold something of Rockwell's during the main period of abstract expressionism, and in fact things were sold, you know, the fees were not comparable at all. You know, we know of a very important Rockwell, a painting called Breaking Home Ties. If you remember it, it's a father at a railway station with his son who's going, he's a rancher, son's going off to college, and they're waiting for the train in such a small town that they're going to have to flag the train down with a lantern. That painting you know, was among the favorites of Saturday Evening Post viewers, and that also brought a very high record in terms of auction. But you know, I think the reevaluation of artists. What I wanted to say about that particular piece, in 1960, it was actually sold to another illustrator for $900. And you know, Rockwell actually didn't want to sell it. You know, he wasn't somebody who, you see, if we had known. You know, he's somebody who really felt that he was working for the printed page. So he was not accustomed to selling his originals, though oftentimes the publishers would keep them. Yeah. So, any questions about anything we've talked about so far, or anything you want to share? Yeah.
Did Rockwell have any kind of rapport with Thomas Hart Benton?
Oh, it's a great question. You know, not as far as I know. However, I'm glad you mentioned Benton, and you might know in mentioning him that Jackson Pollock was taught by Thomas Hart Benton.
Right,
yes.
And when I was looking at the painting in the other room, which doesn't really remind me of a Pollock, it's definitely a Rockwell.
It's definitely a Rockwell version of a Pollock, right?
There's figures in there. I mean, you can sit there and kind of make out figures. And I just recently read a book about Benton and Pollock. And the way he taught Pollock was to begin his abstraction process figuratively. And then the premise of this art historian was that even in his later drip paintings, you can still discern some kind of a figurative.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. As a matter of fact, so Thomas Hart Benton was known as an American regionalist. He was from the Midwest, and he was not an abstractionist by any means, but he created these very kind of almost like mannerist style, dramatic and heroic pictures of Americans at work. And so whether it was Americans who were farming, or they were working in a mine, or they were doing some technological process, you know, you had this great sense of these enormous paintings and figures that were very heroic. And Pollock, you know, Pollock did actually paint, as you said, figuratively early on when he was in Benton's class. And even after he started to work abstractly, he named some of his paintings with names of things that would be recognizable. But he fairly soon after started to number his paintings, name them with numbers, because, you know, the prevailing idea was that you don't want to have people thinking about anything else but the experience of looking at paint on a canvas. You don't want people to, you know, feel as though a painting is a you know, three-dimensional window into another world, and you don't want to support the idea that painting is illusionistic. So this is Clement Greenberg's quote. He says, realistic naturalistic art had dissembled the medium using art to conceal art. Modernism used art to call attention to art, and what he is calling art is pure, you know, pure paint on canvas, essentially, without allusion to naturalistic things. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Another movement that I think was significant in the 60s and moving into the 70s and 80s was photorealism. During Rockwell's time, I'll just mention that the magazines, even at the time that Rockwell painted The Connoisseur, were changing. Television was a new medium at the time. You know, television came in about the mid-1940s, but it wasn't really until the 50s that people had TVs in their homes. But it was clear that TV was going in a direction that was going to usurp a lot of the advertising dollars that would have gone into the magazines. And so photography also began to replace the illustrator, because photographs were viewed as in the moment, and illustration was filtered through the lens of an artist, which took a lot more time. So there's an interesting connection between the photograph and the painting in photorealism. So, I mean, what do you notice about these two paintings? They're by the same artist, whose name was Ralph Goings. He's actually still living. He lives out west. How would you describe them? What do you see?
Diner.
You see a diner. That's important, because in the 50s and 60s, and certainly beyond that, diner culture became important. Diners were gathering places where people from all walks of life could be. They could be anonymous, or they could be together. So it could be a kind of a social gathering place. So the diner itself became an important icon of American culture. Yeah. What else do you notice about them?
brand name.
What?
There's a lot of brand name.
Yes,
inside.
absolutely. So the artists were not afraid of putting commercial culture into their paintings. So you have Heinz tomato ketchup, which doesn't look so different today, right? There's definitely the Kellogg's mini boxes of cereal, which we still have today, and of course Pepsi Cola. So great, that's an important observation. What else about them? How would you, I mean, how are these different from, say, maybe how a Norman Rockwell would present a diner scene?
They look totally realistic.
Yes, they look totally realistic. They look as though they could be photographs, and yet there's a kind of separation from the humanistic aspect of what a person might have experienced if they were in a diner. They're literally looking very objectively at the elements of a diner. So here, you know, this is really an abstract composition. Look at how that works. You know, there's the big crackly menu, which is a big rectangle, essentially. And then you have 1, 2, 3 verticals, and you could almost compare it to the Barnett Newman in the other room in terms of its structure. So these are people who are bringing a very abstract modernist sensibility, influenced, highly influenced by photography, but they're taking the self out. They're taking you out of it. You know, you can admire this, I think, in a variety of ways, but what you probably don't imagine here is the people sitting around the table. You know, you're totally captivated by just the individual elements, the beautiful reflection on the Formica table. Amazing, that's a watercolor. So, you know, they were quite extraordinary. And I think in the pie case here, you know, this is a scene that it would be well known to many of us. The other thing to notice is that you can barely detect a brush stroke. You know, they're very, very finely painted, you know, full of reflection, and you can almost imagine that that would be a very high quality photograph, excepting that it's a painting done by a person's hand.
Were they done from a photograph that were?
Yes, usually the photorealists were working directly from photographs. Exactly.
On canvas.
Well, yes, projection was definitely a way that they were working, but illustrators were working that way too. A lot of illustrators would not admit that they were working from a photograph that was projected in one way or another. But for illustrators, it was a way of, I think, making sure they could make their deadlines. I mean, it took a long time for people to, and Elwood, you might want to say something. You might be the only illustrator who never used a photograph, I'm telling you.
Actually, there was a time when I was trying to work more realistically, and we had an artograph in a studio.
Yes.
It was above projection, and you'd slide things in the artograph. It was pretty primitive, but it worked. And I did some what they call photo trace-offs. But I work in, if anyone knows my work, it's a humorous illustration, whimsical, cartoon-based illustration. And obviously you don't, I use reference, look at a photograph of, I want to see what a lawnmower looks like, a modern one. But other than that, I luckily didn't need to work with photographs, so it's more of a fantasy world. And the stuff I'm doing now is for myself, and it's even more, it's less dependent on any kind of reference at all. It strictly springs from
Right. That's great. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Don't feel bad. In the New York Times read a little article the other day that said that probably Rembrandt himself
Yes.
a photograph, not a photograph, an image of reverse, whatever.
Yep, exactly.
What was that thing, Stephanie? There was a Vermeer. Or one of those.
Yeah, the Vermeer. It was like almost like a pinhole camera.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a thing that projected.
That's right.
I can't remember what it was called. It's a wonderful name.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember the name of it too. Cynthia, do you remember what Vermeer used?
Yeah, some very fair
Yeah,
name.
we have to, yeah. But yes, so artists have been trying to find ways to reproduce the real world for centuries, literally. I'll just share these with you. Robert Cottingham is actually a painter, photorealist who lives in Connecticut. And he's now, I think, in his early 80s. But he was actually trained as a graphic designer. He went to Pratt Institute. He's also studied industrial design. It's great. When I went to his studio, he had these beautiful sketchbooks that he had done at Pratt Institute of, you know, just mundane objects, so beautifully drawn. And so you can see how an artist has a particular interest sometimes that stays with them for a long time. But he worked in commercial advertising, both in New York and California, and then ultimately kind of just quit his job. You know, advertising was very lucrative in the 60s and 70s, and he decided to take a break and just try to be a painter. But the kind of painting that he did brought him back to, I think, his earliest interests of mechanical things. So the Brownie camera, for example, is an object that he remembered using, so it has a kind of a sense of memory about it for him. But it's a very abstract picture. As you can see, even the perspective is a little skewed. You don't really know where you are in it. You're not quite above it, you're definitely not sort of below it, but it sort of puts you in a position of being a little uncomfortable, which is not unusual for you know, modern realist painting. He has a tremendous love of signage. Does anybody else feel that way? Do you love to see the great signs? I love them. But he took a bus trip once to many cities around the country. He got in a Greyhound bus, and he just got off in random locations. And what he said was, well, he uses photography very carefully too, but he was using at that time a slide camera, so he was taking slide film. And he would have to sometimes stay in the same location for several days because he felt that he couldn't get the lighting just right. So he would have to, a little bit like Monet, you know, he'd have to stay in a certain spot for, you know, an hour, and then the light would change and he'd lose his beautiful shadow that he was looking for, so the next day he'd have to come back, and if it was cloudy he'd have to wait another day. So what he was really interested in was almost creating these abstractions that really said something, but there's almost a little bit of irony about this, because if you think about the word oasis, what does that mean to you?
Desert.
Oh, well, yeah, it could, absolutely. Yeah? Solitary or someplace sort of an oasis away from whatever the rest of your world is like. But I think the irony of this probably being, you know, signage that maybe would have been on a commercial building or a bar or something like that was definitely not lost on Robert Cunningham. But you can see he was very exacting too. So his slide would have been projected to create a drawing where he's working out not just composition, but the tonality, where the dark's going to go, where the light's going to go. And then down at the bottom, he creates a watercolor that is going to give a sense of what his palette is going to be like. But you can see how much more vibrant his oil painting is. So he's really capturing a little bit of sense of, you know, that this was probably a neon sign, and it's pretty close. There's a couple, you know, couple of small changes, like there's a little shelf over here that he doesn't carry over. But if you look at this, it's really a combination of abstract shapes and forms that create this composition. So, in terms of realists who got maligned, Andy Warhol was, Andrew Wyeth was another artist who received a lot of criticism during the years in which abstract expressionism was popular and also following. So it was really Wyeth and Rockwell who really captured the brunt of the criticism from the critics, because Andrew Wyeth was an extremely popular artist among the public. But, you know, in terms of critical acclaim, he really did not receive it for quite a few years into his career. You might know that he was the son of the very famous illustrator N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth created illustrations for many classic books, and I think his illustrations really became beloved by the American public. And Andrew was training in his father's studio, and also under one of his father's sisters, who was a very fine painter also. But they were thinking initially that he would be an illustrator, but he really determined that what he wanted to do was just paint. And if you look at this, I think you'll probably understand why he did not consider himself a realist. He thought of his work as abstract. Why do you think that is in looking at that? Do you get a sense of why?
Very dramatic compositions.
Yeah. Yeah, very dramatic compositions. You know, you have these beautiful sweeps of horizontal space, and even though we can recognize the skeleton and, you know, a tree shape, he really was all about establishing mood and a sort of a sense of an underlying emotion within his paintings.
He also, I've read some about him, and I like his work, but he read some, when you're under in the shadow of a famous father,
yes,
both men and women who are any creative field, it's very difficult. And I think part of his reason to become a painter and move in this direction, because his father was a towering figure. He did like Treasure Island and things. And
yes.
His paintings, the way he used paint, I mean, there's almost no one better.
Yes, that's true.
And I think he must have felt at some point that he couldn't outdo Dad for that. So
yeah, I think.
His own way.
Yeah, he found his own way, and I think that's a great observation. We do have in the far gallery a small early illustration by Andrew Wyeth, and you know, you can almost feel that the tightness in it, that, you know, he doesn't have at that point the ability to be as expressive as he is here. He also really became known for these kind of searching portraits that he did of, in some cases, people that he painted year after year after year, his neighbors and friends, and people that he knew both in the Brandywine Valley in Pennsylvania, but also in Maine, where the family had a summer retreat on Monhegan Island. And so... and
he painted with unusual technique.
Yes. Say a little about that, please.
Well, I don't know a lot about it, but he worked in egg tempera, right?
He did. He worked in egg tempera.
Actual eggs, and it's a very time-consuming way of working.
Yes.
His work is never dynamic like his dad's. There's a real flatness to almost all his work, Christine's World or anything there.
Yeah. They're
all very flat. That's part of the fact that he was trying for modernism in terms of design, but it's also because I think the pigment itself wasn't meant to be dynamic like oil paint.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's a technique that came down, you know, from medieval times, where, you know, you'd have pigment, dry pigment, and the artist would be using egg yolk and mixing it in to create tempera paint, which is a kind of an opaque watercolor, essentially.
Get dried egg off a plate.
Yeah, so you know, right. And actually, you know, Wyeth did. Yeah, it has a beautiful sheen. And oftentimes artists would have to work on panel because it did have a brittleness to it, you know, so, and in some cases Wyeth did, yeah. His son, Jamie Wyeth, is actually seen here in these two paintings. And Jamie has done a variety of things. I mean, he is definitely a realist, and left school at a very young age knowing that he wanted to be a painter. So he studied again in the family studio. He traveled to New York at a very young age, where he actually got to know Andy Warhol very well. They became friends, and you know, really wanted to kind of soak up what was happening in the art world, even in the world of ballet, which he became very interested in documenting. This painting is actually fairly recent. It's 2012, but what's really fun about it is if you look at the background, it could almost be an abstract expressionist painting. It's called Catching Pollen, and it focuses on Jamie Wyeth's wife, Carolyn, who unfortunately, she was you know, an excellent horsewoman, but when she was in her, and she had actually been an aide to John F. Kennedy, but in her early 20s, she was in a car accident and paralyzed from the waist down. But here, I mean, it's very poignant because she's standing in this kind of joyous position, holding herself up on her crutches and, you know, sort of in this very old-fashioned kind of an outfit, catching pollen on her tongue. So I think what Jamie Wyeth tends to be interested in is capturing personalities of those around him, and he's really swung his style in a variety of ways to suit the subject matter that he's working on. This one I think is really kind of fun. Do some of you know of the painter Rockwell Kent? Have you heard of Rockwell Kent? Okay. So Rockwell Kent, as you may recall, did a lot of very dramatic paintings, often of landscapes that you know, of rugged coastlines, and his paintings tended to be very graphic, powerful, strong color. But this is a Jamie Wyeth portrait of Rockwell Kent. Now, he never met Rockwell Kent, but Rockwell Kent was one of the many artists who actually did summer for a period of time on Monhegan Island. And this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek because there was a mystery on the island about this woman. Can you see? So there's a narrative element here, somebody falling off a cliff. And the story was, I want to try to remember her name. I can't remember her name. I know I have it in here. Okay, Sally Moran. You know, was a close friend of Rockwell Kent. And something mysterious happened, which was that while taking a walk around the island, she disappeared. And her body was washed up about 3 weeks later. And it was found that though she had, I think, a head injury, she had not drowned, according to, you know, the reports, and she did not have any other injuries that would have indicated her falling off a steep cliff into the sea. So nobody ever really figured out what happened to her. And so it remains a mystery. So, you know, and actually, Jamie Wyeth did a couple of paintings that dealt with some of that island lore, which is always interesting. But Edward Hopper actually painted on Monhegan Island. There were many people who went there as a summer retreat because the landscape, you know, and you get a little bit of it here in the Rockwell Kent portrayal, was so dramatic and beautiful.
Did Jamie and his dad get along?
Yes, as far as I know. As far as I know. Though, I mean, the challenges of being in an artist's family, I mean, Norman Rockwell has 3 sons. 2 of them are artists. And it's difficult. Peter lives in Italy. He moved to Italy in the 60s. Rockwell's reputation is enormous, was enormous at the time. So I think that, you know, as you pointed out earlier, that's a little bit of a challenge for artist families, for sure. Any questions in here? And of course, there's Philip Pearlstein, who brought a completely different perspective to modernism. He was known for creating these very dramatic nudes that were combined with some pretty incongruous elements. You know, like in this case, if you look at the way he's handled the the figure is broken into abstract areas or planes. So he has a sort of a very distant eye. He's not engaged emotionally with these people at all. He almost doesn't portray them as people. They're almost elements that are designed into his composition. But then he brings in things that really confuse you, like a big whirligig, you know, a sort of a flying robin toy, you know, an owl that's hanging from a string, and these very dynamic patterns, all of which kind of weave together to create, you know, something that is in some ways more abstract than real. Any reaction to this? What do you think?
I wouldn't want it in my living room.
Would you be dizzy? A little bit, right? Yeah.
Great conversation piece.
It's a great conversation piece, that's right. Yeah, just the painting and a couch, that's it. The exhibition goes on a little bit to look at some other contemporary painters who are working a little more in our own time, but what I'd really like to show you quickly is how illustration evolved. So let's take a little walk to the far gallery. It looks a little bit at how illustration was reacting to changes in the art world, because illustrators too were trying to remain contemporary and modern. You know, they were interested in the vocabulary of modernism, but they had to, by the virtue of their professions, continue to tell visual stories. So I'll just start with this painting here, if you're able to see it. This is a painting called No Passing, which was a cover for the Saturday Evening Post in 1954 by somebody who was a little younger than Norman Rockwell. His name was Stephen Dohanos. And Dohanos did a lot of work for the Post and other magazines, and for 30 years he was actually the, basically the art director at the United States Postal Service. So he was the one who was kind of driving what postage stamps were actually illustrated, and working with a lot of illustrators on those projects. But I don't know, can you see what's happening here? What's the story?
You have an antique car that's holding up the traffic.
Exactly. So it's kind of fun because in 1954 these were the modern cars, and they are being driven insane because they cannot get around the old-fashioned buggy. That's right. It really is, I think, in many ways exactly what happened with mid-century abstraction. You know, we had artists who were just trying to get around the tried and true, trying to create something different. And here, of course, Dohanos is working in a very traditional way. He's creating a picture that is a window into a three-dimensional world. He uses this great snaking curve with shapes that recede in scale to give you the sense that there's depth in the picture. But very quickly that actually begins to shift, and you have illustrators like Robert Cunningham. He was really an exceptional leader in some ways in the new illustration as you move a little bit further into the late 20th century. What's different about these from that? Or from Norman Rockwell's? Right. Not much depth at all. This could almost be an abstract color field painting were it not for the introduction of the figures, which he would have needed to include as the illustrator. This was actually a stamp design that Cunningham created for the 1980 Summer Olympics. He actually created 27 stamp designs at that time. And you can see that the figure is very readable. We know it's a runner, and yet it's not delineated in the way that, say, a Norman Rockwell would have done it. The background, it's literally swaths of color that could maybe replicate or indicate there's some kind of landscape behind him, but we don't really know. So artists are really trying to kind of bridge the gap between narrative, illustration, and fine art in creating something like this. This artist here, his name was Bernie Fuchs, and he was considered to be a real trendsetter in the late 20th century. you can see that he is still working with narrative elements. In fact, the Fuchs family donated this to the Norman Rockwell Museum because they felt like there'd really be a nice connection between Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want and the other gallery. But this is a very different kind of family gathering. You know, in Rockwell's piece, everybody's laughing, you know, they're looking at each other, they're talking. What's the difference here? Yeah, there's a sense of separation, exactly. So what artists are beginning to pick up on and show is the tension that actually is evident in the world in general. You know, the complexity of family relationships. Here you have the father's kind of looking little gingerly off in this direction. He's looking to the side. The only one really looking at us is the baby. And you also see that he's using a technique that was being used by contemporary painters. He's working on unprimed canvas. He's basically staining his canvas with a thinned out kind of an oil paint and creating an effect that, you know, on the one hand would have been created, as Elwood was saying earlier, with sort of a projected photograph, but also he loses the detail too. So he, you know, he gives you indication that there are things there, but he's not tightly wedded to what they really look like. So it was another way of doing things.
Well, it also makes it look more like a watercolor too.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. You know, the way in which he was using his paint, I think definitely is almost has a stained glass effect.
Contemporary families, there are
Yes.
no women, dinner where mother is not there,
Yes,
different views from above.
yes, that's a great point. You know, that one of the ways to look at these things is what's missing.
Well, I might
Yeah.
add, without talking too much here,
No.
but Rockwell had a unique situation because he did covers that he created all by himself. Wasn't
Yes.
like a fine artist. He decided he would do something, and he did it, and they generally bought it. For I'm thinking of the Saturday Evening Post. This is in his height of his career. He was in charge of the whole thing. Bernie Fuchs, like me and all these illustrators, except for Marshall Harrison, worked by assignment. You read a manuscript. You submit a sketch, you get approval on the sketch, or don't, or they make changes, and then you do the finish.
Right.
So the movie that is here is not something that Bernie made up. I mean, he made it up, but it was because the story itself
Right.
he was working from suggested that it was maybe a divorced family. But so illustration like this is different in that it is a bit of a slave to text, to the story, to the article.
Mm-hmm. That's an important point.
They're trying to do, he even, this must be an earlier piece because he got pretty abstract with his
He
line.
did, he got very
He was a
abstract,
wonderful
that's
draftsman,
right.
But he was the one, when I first started, I was in art school in Chicago. I so wanted to be Bernie Fuchs, but I couldn't draw pretty girls. I didn't have the chops.
Obviously neither could he.
Right, not in this one.
No, he really could. Yeah, right, to eliminate it altogether.
But that's an important point, Elwood, thank you. Rockwell, for his covers, yes, he was really depicting things that he wanted to paint for the most part. I mean, there were restrictions in terms of what the magazine would allow, but you know, he had a lot of leeway. He did do story illustration also, though, that dealt with the text, and he did advertising, which was the least favorite of the work that he liked to do. Like, he worked for the Boy Scouts for 50 years and, you know, continued to be a little bit frustrated about all the corrections that had to be made, things like that. So he was lucky in terms of his covers, not being art directed to a very high degree. But the other thing that changed here is the kinds of articles that were being presented were different too, because the articles dealt with a lot of psychological concerns, emotional concerns. Like Robert Weaver, who was a leader in the 1960s, said, how would Norman Rockwell have dealt with the issue of left-handedness? You know, something that's kind of abstract that would be hard to paint about unless you were doing something a little bit more symbolic or metaphorical. So, you know, the nature of what was being written about changed things as well. You start to see artists kind of finding a new way of working. Weaver was very interested in portraying time. So this, for example, is a painting of Lincoln Park in 1968 when they had the Democratic National Convention there. And if you remember, there were actually riots at the time. And so he shows the calm almost before the storm, when the troopers are actually marching in to quelch things. So he's finding a way in one image to say a little bit more about almost a before and after experience.
Was Norman Rockwell, did any of his covers have any political, I mean, if you were
Right.
today, would
You know what?
given any?
I think that's a great question. Rockwell, when he was painting for the Post, had to be a little bit apolitical, but there were times when he expressed things that he felt were important. I mean, I would almost go back to his Four Freedoms, where he said, these ideals are important, I want to portray them, and the Post actually stepped in to publish them. But it wasn't really until he left the Post in '63 and began to work for Look magazine that he was able to portray issues that were a little bit more political. So, for example, in the room here, you'll see his 1964 Problem We All Live With, which shows, talks about the integration of the public schools. The integration of our suburbs is something that he's addressed, murder of civil rights workers. So that, later in his career, I think he became a kind of an elder statesman who was very trusted, and I think he came to a point where he wanted to say something greater, I think, with his work. At the time that we're looking at here, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, there were not very many female illustrators who were working freelance. But two of them were Barbara Nessum and Jackie Morgan. And Barbara actually attended Pratt Institute, and it's almost, well, she worked in the fashion industry for a while and then went out on her own to do freelance. But this piece gives you an idea of how things were changing. It's actually a piece called Women and Madness, from 1972, done for Ms. Magazine. Anybody remember Ms.? Sure. Right. So, a magazine that really helped carry the women's movement forward. A lot of the women's magazines were not necessarily doing that in the same kind of way. So here we see something that's much more symbolic than realistic. We recognize the figure of the woman, but she's literally broken apart and is coming unraveled, literally unraveled, and we see that there's another woman who's kind of upside down at the end of that ribbon. So the question becomes, how do you portray something that's challenging? So the article was about, women who are dealing with now being professionals, having families, having to deal with lots of things that create imbalance. And how do you do that? So, you start to see some of the contemporary issues driving what illustrations begin to look like. And then you have artists who do these wonderful autographic drawings. Alan E. Kober, who, was extremely popular in the 1980s. And this is actually a self-portrait of him. And he, it's a little bit strange because this was done, it's one of his later works, done in 1997, and he actually did die shortly after it. So it almost pre-saw what was happening with his life in terms of the skeletons and things. But he was a wonderful artist and extremely inventive. But in the late 20th century, a lot of magazines were actually including illustration that was a little bit more on the edge, because magazines were starting, or not just starting, but trying to maintain relevance. So artists were sometimes allowed to be a little bit more creative with their work. You knew Alan Kober, didn't you? Is there anything you'd want to add?
That particular, he was one of my favorites in
Yeah.
my early I'm always having a hard time finding my own voice. Mount Stockland, he was an influence. He has a little series of works that are very crosshatchy, Alan Cooper-esque.
Yes.
But yeah, I really like his work a lot. He's someone that's only recently been sort of revived in terms of,
Yeah.
when the web was becoming big and you do these searches, I did a web search for Alan E. Cooper.
And you couldn't find anything, yeah.
And it was embarrassing. It's one of our
Yep.
great illustrators of the certain period is, but he's now, thanks to his wife and his daughter,
Right.
bringing background.
That's true. He always kept a sketchbook. And one of the most wonderful things, I think, in the exhibition is this sketchbook by Alan E. Cooper. So he found this book that had nice paper, but when he brought it home and he opened it up, he realized that it was actually a birthday book. So it had dates, and and his idea was to put on each date the person who had a birthday on that date. So he would actually draw directly from life, and the portraits are amazing. They're absolutely amazing. So they're of his family, of just people he knew. Sometimes they were people of historical figures who he knew had a birthday on that date. And it's just an extraordinary treasure. But he really just kept drawing. One of the things that was very interesting about him is he was also a visual journalist. He was actually probably the artist who brought scandal to life in a certain way. One of them was a home for mentally disabled people on Staten Island called Willowbrook. Does anybody remember that story? And he went in to Willowbrook and he did these heart-wrenching drawings that were actually published as a book. And it brought tremendous attention to what then, at the time was really terrible conditions in that location. So, lots of examples of how an artist's work can really have the impact, the power to call attention to something that might not otherwise be seen.
That book was out of print for a long time, but it's back in print, right?
I think so. Yep, I think so. And then, of course, he experimented and did a big ceramic bowl self-portrait of himself. So, just being willing to cross different media. Anita Kunz is actually a Canadian illustrator, and we were very fortunate to get a donation of 8 original artworks. She's somebody who uses metaphor and symbolism in her work. She does a lot of art for the New Yorker, the New York Times, many well-known publications. But anybody know what this is about? Can you imagine what it might be about? Yes, exactly. Yes, it does. That's true. That's true. So this was done in 1998. It was called The National Affair. And it's an example of an illustrator being very visually literate, because she's taking a convention from another time period. So you have a sense of this almost being an icon, a kind of a religious icon. And what do you think the message is here that she's trying to convey? Well, that's it, that he's sort of a martyr, right? That this is how maybe during the medieval times a martyr might be represented with flames coming up and hands bound together. So she's drawing upon one thing to say something else. And Tim O'Brien, who's now the president of the Society of Illustrators, which is a longtime organization for illustrators, also uses metaphor. This is a piece that he did for personal use. And you can see this is something that is almost surrealistic. It brings two things together that really would never be together: a steam engine kind of plowing ahead on a stormy sea. And he basically talks about the fact that he doesn't like to give up. So this is his symbol of not giving up. But this was a Time magazine cover that he did in 2011 called The World of Gaddafi. And at the time, Gaddafi was basically, his regime was on its way out, and he uses the metaphor of the sands of the desert, literally blowing the figure away. So you can see how artists are adapting. They're using different techniques. They're becoming they're still, illustrators are still visual storytellers, but they're finding new ways to tell those stories in ways that feel contemporary to the moment. So, thank you so much for spending a little time today.